The first time I heard about the Poinciana woman, I was nursing a stubby at the Trailer Boat Club in Darwin, half listening to a couple of grey nomads swap yarns about their travels through the territory. They dropped their voices when they got to the bit about Darwin's southern outskirts, where the red flowering trees line the old highway like soldiers standing at attention. The woman leaned forward, her weathered hands wrapped tight around a gin and tonic that had gone warm in the humid air. Ice cubes clinked against the glass as she spoke. "She appears when the poincianas are in full bloom," she said, glancing around the pub like she was sharing state secrets. "Always at night, always under the biggest tree." Her voice carried the flat vowels of South Australia, but there was something else underneath. Fear, maybe, or the kind of certainty that comes from hearing a story too many times to dismiss it. My cousin's mate saw her last year, pale as moonlight, wearing a dress that looked like it belonged in the 80s. The woman's husband nodded gravely, his sunburned face creased, with lines that spoke of decades under the territory's sun. He reached across the table and touched his wife's wrist, a gesture so automatic it looked like muscle memory. "Bloke who told us about it said she calls out to men walking alone," he continued. "Sweet voice, like she's lost and needs help." He paused to take a sip of his beer, leaving a wet ring on the scratched table surface. "But anyone who goes to her." They both went quiet then, glancing around the pub like the woman might materialize between the poker machines and the fish tank. The silence stretched long enough for me to hear the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of pool balls clicking together. I snorted into my beer, the sound sharp in the sudden quiet. Bloody tourists. Give them a week in Darwin during the dry season, and suddenly they're experts on local folklore. The territory had enough real dangers: crocodiles that could snap a man in half, snakes with venom that killed in minutes, heat that could cook your brain if you weren't careful. We didn't need to invent ghostly women lurking under pretty trees. I should have paid more attention. The thing is, once you hear a story like that, you start noticing things you never saw before. Driving my rig between Darwin and Catherine, I'd always passed those stands of poincianas without a second thought. Royal poinciana trees, flame trees, whatever you wanted to call them. They were just part of the landscape, spectacular when they bloomed, but nothing more remarkable than the boab trees or the pandanus palms that dotted the roadside. After that night at the pub, though, I found myself glancing toward them whenever I passed. My eyes would drift from the road to the red canopy, looking for movement in the shadows beneath. Especially near the big grove about 20 kilometers south of Darwin, where the old highway curved past a cluster of trees so massive their trunks looked like they'd been growing since the dreamtime. The scent would hit me through the cab's air vents when I drove past, sweet and heavy, like perfume mixed with something darker. It made my head swim sometimes, that smell. Made me want to pull over and walk among the trees just to breathe it in properly. More stories filtered through over the next few weeks, the way stories do in small communities where everyone knows everyone else's business. A barramundi fisherman at Mindil Beach mentioned his brother-in-law had heard something about missing persons cases linked to those trees. He'd been setting up his gear near the boat ramp when he told me, hands busy with tackle, while his mouth ran on about strange disappearances. "Blokes who just vanish," he'd said, threading a hook with the kind of automatic precision that comes from years of practice. "Always near them red trees, always during flowering season." A woman at the Catherine Roadhouse said her Aboriginal friends wouldn't go near the poincianas after dark. Not during flowering season. She'd been wiping down tables when she'd mentioned it, her movements sharp and efficient, but her hands had stilled when she'd talked about the trees, cloth frozen against the laminate surface. "Old people know things," she'd said quietly. "They don't always explain why, but they know." Even old Pete, who'd been running cattle in the territory since before I was born, made some comment about respecting the spirits that lived in the red trees. He'd been checking his cattle truck's tires when he'd said it, voice casual like he was discussing the weather, but his eyes had been serious when they'd met mine across the dusty car park. Still, it was just talk. Darwin was full of characters with stories to tell, and the territory attracted people who liked their legends larger than life. Miners who swore they'd seen min-min lights dancing over the ranges. Station hands who claimed they'd heard the cries of the bunyip echoing across billabongs. Tourists who insisted they'd photographed UFOs hovering over Kakadu. I had freight to move, deadlines to meet, and no time for campfire tales about ghostly women. That was my attitude right up until Jimmy Kowalski disappeared. Jimmy and I went back 15 years, ever since I'd started running the Darwin-Catherine route for Henderson Transport. He worked construction in Darwin, good steady work when the projects were flowing, which they usually were in the territory's endless boom-bust cycle. But he'd grown up in Catherine, in a weatherboard house near the river where his mum still lived. Still cooked massive Sunday roasts for whoever showed up. Still kept his childhood bedroom exactly the way he'd left it when he'd moved to Darwin at 18. He made the drive south every few weeks to visit her, to check on the house and help with whatever needed fixing. We'd developed a routine over the years, the kind that develops between mates without anyone planning it. He'd time his trips to coincide with my runs, meet me at the Catherine Roadhouse for a counter meal and a few beers. We'd catch up on news from Darwin while I grabbed some sleep before the return trip, talk about work, about women, about the price of fuel and the state of the roads. Normal bloke conversation, the kind that doesn't need to go deep to mean something. He was supposed to meet me on a Thursday night in March. The poincianas were in full bloom that year, the whole drive south punctuated by explosions of red flowers against the blue territory sky. The color was so intense it almost hurt to look at, like someone had splashed blood across a canvas the size of the horizon. The scent drifted through my cab's vents even with the windows up, sweet and cloying and somehow urgent. I'd pulled into the roadhouse around 6, expecting to find Jimmy's white Toyota Ute already there, in its usual spot near the diesel pumps. But the car park held only the usual collection of road trains, caravans and rental cars, full of tourists, taking photos of everything that moved. No worries, I thought, pulling my rig into a parking bay that could accommodate the trailer. Jimmy ran on territory time at the best of times, and if he'd stopped for a few drinks with his construction mates, he could be running hours late. The roadhouse was busy with the usual evening crowd, truckies grabbing dinner, grey nomads comparing notes on caravan parks, a few local Aboriginal kids sharing a packet of chips near the video games. I grabbed a shower that cost $5 for 3 minutes of lukewarm water, ordered a steak that came with chips and a token effort at salad, and settled in to wait. The meat was overcooked and the beer was cold, which put the meal solidly in the acceptable category for roadhouse food. I'd eaten worse, and in far less comfortable surroundings. By 10 o'clock, I was checking my phone every few minutes. No missed calls, no text messages, nothing from Jimmy to explain where he was. I tried calling him, listening to the phone ring 6 times before going to voicemail. His voice on the recording sounded younger than he was, more optimistic. "You've reached Jimmy. Leave a message and I'll get back to you." I didn't leave a message. What was I going to say? By midnight, I was checking my phone every few minutes, like a teenager, waiting for a text from a girl. Jimmy wasn't answering calls or texts, which wasn't entirely unusual. Phone coverage between Darwin and Catherine had more gaps than a broken fence. But something felt off, like a tire with a slow leak that you can't quite locate. Jimmy was reliable about our meetups, had been for years. He'd shown up hungover, he'd shown up late, he'd even shown up once with a black eye from a pub fight he couldn't quite remember. But he'd always shown up. If he was going to be seriously late, he'd have found a way to let me know, would have called from a payphone or asked someone else to pass on a message. I was considering driving back toward Darwin to look for him, when 2 police officers walked into the roadhouse. The older patrons went quiet, the way people do when law enforcement shows up unexpectedly. Even the kids by the video games turned to look, their young faces suddenly wary. The younger officer, a constable with sunburned arms and nervous eyes that suggested he was still new to the job, approached my table. He walked like he was trying to project authority, but wasn't quite sure he'd earned it yet. "You wouldn't be Dave Morrison, would you?" My stomach dropped like a stone thrown into deep water. The kind of drop that tells you something's gone wrong before your brain catches up. "Yeah, that's me. We found your name and number in a vehicle registered to James Kowalski." The constable's voice was carefully neutral, the way cops talk when they're delivering bad news but don't know how bad yet. "White Toyota Ute, found abandoned about 20 kilometers north of here." He paused, consulting a notebook with pages that fluttered in the roadhouse's air conditioning. "You know Mr. Kowalski, Jimmy?" "Yeah, he's a mate." I was already standing, grabbing my keys from the table surface where they'd been sitting next to my empty beer bottle. "We were supposed to meet here tonight. Where did you find the Ute?" The senior constable, an Aboriginal woman with sergeant's stripes and tired eyes that had seen too much, exchanged a glance with her partner. She looked like she'd been working territory policing long enough to know that most missing persons cases didn't end well. that the vast emptiness of the Outback swallowed people whole and rarely gave them back. "Side of the old highway, pulled off near some poinciana trees," she said. Her voice carried the authority that came with years of experience. Engine was still running, driver's door open. Personal effects still inside. Wallet, phone, keys to his flat in Darwin. She paused, and in that pause I could hear everything she wasn't saying. No sign of the owner. The drive to where they'd found Jimmy's ute took 15 minutes, but it felt like hours. I followed the police car through the warm territory night, my hands gripping the steering wheel tight enough to leave marks. My mind was racing through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Maybe Jimmy had pulled over feeling sick and wandered into the bush, disoriented by heat exhaustion or something he'd eaten. Maybe he'd seen an accident and gone to help, lost track of time while dealing with injured tourists. Maybe his phone had been flat, and he was walking back toward Catherine, hoping to flag down help from a passing road train. Maybe a lot of things. But when I saw where his ute was parked, the stories I'd dismissed started crawling up my spine like huntsman spiders in the dark. The vehicle sat at the edge of the old highway, nose pointed toward a magnificent stand of royal poinciana trees in full crimson bloom. The positioning looked deliberate, like Jimmy had pulled over specifically to look at the grove. Even in the harsh glare of the police spotlights, the scene was beautiful in a way that made your chest tight. Dozens of massive trees creating a canopy of red flowers that seemed to glow against the star-filled sky. Their trunks were ancient and gnarled, bark scarred by decades of territory weather and Aboriginal fire management. The sweet, heavy scent of poinciana blossoms filled the air, almost overwhelming in its intensity. It was like breathing perfume mixed with something darker. Something that made the back of your throat itch. Jimmy's ute looked tiny beneath those ancient trees, dwarfed by their size and age. The white paint looked ghostly pale in the artificial light. The driver's door hung open like a mouth frozen mid-scream. The police had cordoned off the immediate area with yellow tape that fluttered in the slight breeze. But I could see Jimmy's phone on the passenger seat, screen dark, but undamaged. His wallet lay open on the dashboard, credit cards and driver's license, visible in their plastic sleeves. A half-empty bottle of water sat in the cup holder, still cold to the touch, when one of the officers checked it. Everything suggesting he'd intended to return in minutes, not disappear entirely into the territory night. "Any idea why he'd have stopped here?" the sergeant asked, watching me examine the scene with sharp eyes that missed nothing. I shook my head, but I was thinking about those stories from the pub. About a woman who appeared under the biggest poinciana tree, calling to men walking alone. Jimmy had been driving alone, and there was definitely a massive poinciana at the center of that grove. Larger than the others, its trunk so wide that 3 men couldn't have reached around it with their arms outstretched. "No," I said finally, the lie sitting heavy on my tongue. "No reason at all." The police did their job with the thoroughness that comes from experience with territory disappearances. They took statements from me and the roadhouse staff, asking detailed questions about Jimmy's state of mind, his recent behavior, any problems he might have been having. They searched the immediate area with flashlights that carved bright circles out of the darkness. The beams swept back and forth through the grove, illuminating patches of red flowers and dark bark. Search dogs arrived from Darwin, German shepherds, with serious expressions and handlers who moved with quiet efficiency. The dogs courted the area systematically, noses to the ground, following scent trails that led nowhere. They called for a helicopter to do an aerial survey at first light, hoping the bird's-eye view might reveal something the ground search had missed. But they found nothing. No tracks leading into the bush, no blood, no signs of a struggle. No indication that Jimmy had been dragged away by wild animals or attacked by other people. It was as if he had simply stopped his ute, left the engine running, and vanished into the warm territory night, like smoke dispersing in a breeze. By dawn, I was exhausted but too wired to sleep. The kind of bone-deep tiredness that comes with worry, combined with adrenaline that wouldn't let me rest. The police had released the scene after photographing everything from multiple angles. They'd towed Jimmy's ute back to Catherine for processing, looking for fingerprints or DNA that might explain what had happened. They'd promised to expand their search once the sun was up, to bring in more personnel and cover a wider area. I should have gone back to the roadhouse, caught a few hours, rest in my cab before starting the return trip to Darwin. Should have called my dispatcher and explained that I'd be delayed, let them reschedule the delivery that was waiting for me up north. Instead, I found myself walking among the poinciana trees, breathing in their cloying sweetness and trying to make sense of what had happened to my mate. The silence was the first thing that struck me, how complete and unnatural it felt. The territory bush is never truly quiet during the day. There are always birds calling, honey-eaters and rainbow lorikeets, the harsh cry of cockatoos, the liquid notes of magpies greeting the dawn. Insects buzz constantly, a background hum that becomes so familiar you only notice it when it stops. Small animals rustle through the undergrowth, lizards scurrying over dried leaves, wallabies moving through the grass with soft footfalls. But standing among those poincianas, I heard nothing except the faint whisper of wind through the red flowers. Even the highway noise seemed muffled, as if the trees themselves were absorbing sound. My footsteps on the carpet of fallen petals made no sound at all. I walked slowly toward the largest poinciana, the one that dominated the center of the grove like an ancient king holding court. Its trunk was massive, easily 3 meters around, with bark that looked almost silver in the early morning light. The surface was scarred with old cuts and scratches, some that might have been made by tools, others that looked like claw marks from climbing animals. Red flowers carpeted the ground beneath it in a layer so thick it was like walking on a mattress. The air was so thick with their scent, it was almost hard to breathe, sweet and cloying and somehow urgent. It made my head swim, made me think of funeral parlors and hospital rooms. That's when I noticed the other things. Patches of grass that looked trampled, though not recently. The impressions were old, filled in with new growth, but still visible if you knew what to look for. Scratches on the big tree's trunk that might have been initials, though too weathered to read clearly. The bark around them was darker, as if stained by something that had soaked in deep, and something else. A feeling, hard to describe, like standing in a place where something important had happened, something final and irreversible. The air felt heavy with more than just flower scent. It felt weighted with emotion, with pain so old and deep, it had soaked into the ground itself. I was still standing there, trying to process what I was feeling, when a voice behind me said, "You're Jimmy's mate, aren't you?" I turned to find an elderly Aboriginal woman watching me from the edge of the grove. She was small and weathered, with grey hair pulled back in a neat bun and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to see more than they should. Deep lines mapped her face, speaking of decades under the territory's sun and a lifetime of watching the world change around her. She wore a faded floral dress that had seen better years and carried a canvas bag over one shoulder. Her feet were bare, I noticed, toes gripping the red dirt like roots. "Yeah," I said, my voice hoarse from the flower-heavy air. "Dave Morrison. You know Jimmy?" "Know of him, Mary Tungara." She extended a hand, and I shook it, surprised by the strength of her grip. Her palm was calloused from years of work, but her fingers were gentle. "I heard about what happened. Heard you were asking questions." "Police told you that?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. The expression was sad, like she'd seen this story play out before. "Small community around here, Dave. Word travels fast, especially when it's bad word." Mary stepped into the grove, but I noticed she didn't approach the big poinciana tree directly. She kept to the edges, her bare feet finding paths between the fallen flowers. Her eyes moved constantly between the trees as if she were watching for something. Waiting for something. "This isn't the first time," she said quietly. Her voice was soft but carried clearly in the unnatural silence. "What do you mean?" "Men going missing around these trees. Always during flowering season, always at night." She paused near a smaller poinciana, her hand resting against its bark like she was greeting an old friend. "Always men who are carrying something heavy inside." The way she said heavy made my skin crawl, like she was talking about more than physical weight. Her dark eyes fixed on mine, and I felt like she could see straight through to things I didn't want to acknowledge. Guilt, grief, regret, she can smell it on them. The way she said "she" made the hair on my arms stand up. There was certainty in her voice, the kind that comes from knowledge rather than belief. "Who can smell it?" Mary was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the largest poinciana. Red flowers drifted down around us like drops of blood, landing silently on our shoulders and in our hair. That overwhelming floral scent seemed to pulse with each breath, growing stronger and more oppressive. "Her name was Sarah," Mary said finally. Her voice dropped even lower, as if saying the name might summon something neither of us wanted to face. "Sarah Chen. Mixed heritage, like a lot of us around here. Chinese father, Aboriginal mother." She gestured toward the big tree with a movement that was half pointing, half blessing. "Beautiful girl, but lost. Got involved with a white fella from Darwin, older bloke who made her all kinds of promises." Mary's face tightened with old anger, the kind that comes from watching the same tragedy play out again and again. Married man, though he didn't tell her that for months. Said he was going to leave his wife, take Sarah away, start fresh somewhere new. She moved closer to the center of the grove, but still kept her distance from the massive tree. He told her to meet him here one night in 1987. Said he'd made his decision, that he was ready to be with her properly. The air seemed to grow colder as she spoke, though the morning sun was already climbing toward its territory peak. She waited all night under that tree, wearing her best dress, carrying a suitcase with everything she owned. Mary's voice grew softer, sadder, like she was telling a bedtime story that ended badly. Had her grandmother's jewelry in there, photos of her family, clothes she'd bought special for their new life together. I found myself holding my breath, though I wasn't sure why. The silence in the grove seemed to deepen, as if the trees themselves were listening. "He never came," Mary continued. "Never even called to explain. His wife had found out about the affair, threatened to take the kids and half his business if he left." Her voice carried decades of accumulated bitterness. "So he chose the easy path, the safe path. Left Sarah sitting under these trees like a fool." Mary walked to within a few meters of the big poinciana, close enough to touch but still maintaining her careful distance. "Sarah sat under that tree until dawn, then all the next day, then another night." Her voice was barely above a whisper now, but it carried clearly in the oppressive quiet. "People tried to talk to her, convince her to go home, but she wouldn't listen." Mary's eyes were fixed on the tree trunk, as if she could see through the bark to something hidden underneath. "Said he was coming, said he'd promised. Said men don't make promises like that unless they mean them." The temperature drop was becoming more noticeable now, despite the climbing sun. My breath was starting to mist slightly, which should have been impossible in the territory heat. On the third night, she took an overdose of sleeping pills she'd been saving for the honeymoon. Mary's voice broke slightly on the last word. "Died right there under the biggest poinciana, still wearing her wedding dress, still waiting for a man who was never going to come." The silence that followed seemed to press down on us like a physical weight. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and irregular in my chest. Could smell the poinciana flowers so intensely it made me dizzy, like breathing pure perfume. The world felt off balance, like I was standing on the deck of a ship in heavy seas. "And you think, what? That she's still here? Still waiting?" Mary looked at me, with something like pity in her dark eyes. The expression made me feel young and naive, like a city kid, asking why the sun sets. "I don't think anything, Dave, I know." She touched the canvas bag at her shoulder, a gesture that seemed automatic and protective. "My grandmother taught me to see spirits, and I've been seeing Sarah Chen for 35 years. Her voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "She comes out when the trees bloom, calling to men who understand abandonment, men who know what it feels like to be left behind." I wanted to laugh, wanted to dismiss it as superstitious nonsense. Wanted to tell Mary that grief and guilt didn't create ghosts, that dead people stayed dead, no matter how much pain they carried. But standing in that grove of red flowers with Jimmy's disappearance hanging over us like a curse, I found I couldn't summon even a smile. The air was too cold, the silence too complete, the scent of flowers too much like something rotting underneath. "That's..." I started, then stopped. What was it? Crazy? Impossible? I'd been around the territory long enough to know that plenty of impossible things turned out to be true. Had seen min lights dancing over the ranges with my own eyes, heard the cries of animals that shouldn't exist, felt the presence of something ancient in places where the modern world hadn't quite taken hold. "Your mate Jimmy," Mary said gently, her voice cutting through my internal argument. He was carrying something heavy, wasn't he? Something that made him feel guilty, made him feel like he'd been left behind, or like he'd left someone else behind. The question hit me like a punch to the gut, because the answer was yes. Jimmy had been carrying something heavy, something that had been eating at him for months. Something I'd been trying to help him deal with, though not very successfully. And I was the last person to talk to him about it. The memory of our conversation hit me like a physical blow. The truth was, I'd been carrying something heavy too. Mary's words about Jimmy hit so close to home because I knew exactly what had been eating at my mate. I knew because I was part of the reason for it. Jimmy's drinking had gotten worse over the past year, ever since his divorce went through. Not just the usual territory drinking. Everyone out here put away their fair share, especially during the wet season when there wasn't much else to do. But the kind of drinking that starts before noon and doesn't stop until you pass out. The kind that gets you fired from jobs and makes your mates worry about finding you dead in a ditch somewhere. I'd been trying to help him, or at least I told myself that's what I was doing. Meeting him for our regular catch-ups, letting him talk through his problems, offering advice when he asked for it. But the last conversation we'd had, 3 nights before he disappeared, hadn't been about helping. It had been about me losing my patience with his pain. He'd called me at midnight, drunk as a lord, crying about Lisa and the Hilaire Dulloch kids and how everything had gone to shit. Same conversation we'd had a dozen times before, the same litany of regrets and self-recrimination. I was tired, had an early run to Catherine in the morning, and instead of being the mate he needed, I'd been the mate I thought he deserved. The mate who was sick of hearing the same story over and over. Jimmy, for fuck's sake, I'd said, my voice sharp with exhaustion and frustration. You can't keep calling me every time you tie one on. I'm not your bloody therapist. But Dave, you don't understand. His voice had been slurred but desperate, like a drowning man calling for help. I understand plenty, I'd interrupted. I understand you've been feeling sorry for yourself for a year now. I understand Lisa left because you couldn't stop drinking, and now you're drinking because Lisa left. The words had poured out of me like poison I'd been storing up. I understand you lost your job because you showed up half-cut, and now you're drinking because you're unemployed. You see the pattern here? The silence on the other end should have warned me, should have made me back down and try a different approach. Should have reminded me that Jimmy was my mate, not my responsibility. Instead, I'd pushed harder, driven by frustration and the cruel certainty that tough love was what he needed. You want to drink yourself to death, fine, but don't drag me down with you. My voice had been cold, deliberately cutting. Don't call me at midnight expecting me to fix problems you won't even try to solve yourself. I thought you were my mate, Jimmy had said quietly. The hurt in his voice should have stopped me, should have made me apologize and try to repair the damage. Instead, it had made me angrier, because guilt always made me lash out. I am your mate, that's why I'm telling you the truth instead of enabling this bullshit. The words had felt righteous coming out, like I was doing him a favor by being honest. Get help, Jimmy, real help, not just me listening to you whinge at all hours. He'd hung up without another word. The dial tone had buzzed in my ear for long seconds before I'd put the phone down. That was the last time I'd spoken to him. Standing there in the grove with Mary watching me, the weight of those words felt heavier than any load I'd ever carried in my truck. Jimmy hadn't just been abandoned by his wife. I'd abandoned him too. When he needed me most, when he was drowning in guilt and alcohol and self-hatred, I'd turned my back on him. Had decided that his pain was inconvenient, that his need for help was selfish. Yeah, I told Mary, my voice barely above a whisper. He was carrying something heavy. She nodded like she'd expected as much, her dark eyes soft with understanding. The poinciana woman, she can smell guilt from miles away, draws her like blood draws sharks. Mary gathered her canvas bag closer to her body, a protective gesture that seemed unconscious. What about you, Dave? What are you carrying? I didn't answer, couldn't answer. The shame was too fresh, too raw, like a wound that hadn't started healing yet. The knowledge that I'd failed Jimmy when he needed me most, that my last words to him had been cruel and dismissive. Instead, I thanked her for the information and walked back to my truck. My feet felt heavy, like I was walking through deep sand. Behind me, I could feel Mary watching from among the red flowers, standing guard like some kind of ancient sentinel. The next few days blurred together in a haze of police interviews and search parties. The cops were thorough, I'll give them that. Professional and methodical in the way that comes from handling too many disappearances in a place where the landscape itself was hostile to human life. They had helicopters up at first light, the rotors beating the air like mechanical birds as they quartered the search area in grid patterns, search teams combing the bush on foot, volunteers from Catherine and Darwin who gave up their weekends to look for a man they'd never met. They even brought in some tracking dogs from Alice Springs, German shepherds, with serious expressions and handlers who spoke to them in quiet, professional tones. The dogs worked the scent trails systematically, following invisible paths through the scrub. But the territory is vast and unforgiving, a landscape that swallows men whole and rarely gives them back. After 4 days of finding nothing, no tracks, no clothing, no trace that Jimmy had ever existed, they called off the active search. "We'll keep the case open," Senior Sergeant Morrison told me in her office at the Catherine police station. The room was small and overheated, with a desk fan that moved the stale air around without cooling it. "If anyone spots anything, finds any trace, we'll be right back out there with full resources." She leaned back in her chair, and I could see the exhaustion in her eyes. The weight of too many missing persons cases that never got resolved. "But mate, I've got to be honest, after this long, in this heat." She didn't need to finish the sentence. We both knew what happened to people who went missing in the territory bush. The heat killed you in hours if you didn't have water. The wildlife finished what the temperature started. Within days, there was nothing left but bones bleaching in the sun, scattered by wild pigs and dingoes until they were impossible to identify. But I couldn't accept that. Not Jimmy, and not with things left the way they were between us. The guilt was eating at me like acid, the knowledge that my last words to him had been harsh and dismissive. So I started asking around on my own, talking to truckers and station hands, anyone who regularly traveled the roads where Jimmy had gone missing. The territory's a big place, but the community of people who live and work here is small. Everyone knows everyone, or knows someone who knows them. Stories travel fast along the highways, passed from truck stop to roadhouse to pub. That's when I learnt about the others. Old Pete Kowalski, who ran a small roadhouse near Adelaide River, told me about a backpacker who'd vanished in 2019. We were standing by his fuel pumps while I topped up my tank, the diesel smell sharp in the afternoon heat. "German kid, nice enough fellow," Pete said, his weathered hands steady as he cleaned my windscreen. "Car broke down near some poinciana trees about 10 k's out of town. We towed the car back, figured he'd walked into town looking for help." Pete's movements were automatic, practiced, but his eyes were distant. But nobody ever saw him. Police found his passport and wallet still in the car, money untouched. He shook his head, droplets of cleaning fluid flying from the squeegee. "Just vanished like smoke." A station owner named Collins mentioned a jackaroo who'd disappeared in 2015. I'd stopped at his property to ask about road conditions, and the conversation had drifted to Jimmy's disappearance. Collins was a big man with sun-damaged skin and hands like leather, the kind of bloke who'd spent his life working cattle in country that didn't forgive mistakes. "Good worker, reliable as sunrise," he said, leaning against my truck's bumper. One day he just didn't show up for his shift. Found his motorcycle parked under a stand of poincianas, about 50 k's from here. Collins spat into the red dirt, a gesture of frustration rather than disrespect. Never saw hide nor hair of him after that. Police searched for weeks, brought in helicopters and everything. His voice carried the flat acceptance of someone who'd lost people to the territory before. Country's got a way of taking what it wants. The pattern was always the same. Men, alone. Vehicles found abandoned near poinciana trees. The police had investigated each case with the same thoroughness they'd shown with Jimmy's disappearance. But there was never any evidence of foul play, never any leads to follow. No witnesses, no forensic evidence, no logical explanation for why these men had simply walked away from their lives. The men just vanished, as if the earth had opened up and swallowed them whole. By my count, there had been at least 5 disappearances over the past 15 years, all during the dry season when the poincianas were in bloom. Jimmy was just the latest in a pattern that stretched back over a decade. On the 7th night after Jimmy went missing, I made a decision that probably wasn't smart but felt necessary. The kind of decision you make when guilt and grief override common sense. I loaded my ute with camping gear, tent, sleeping bag, portable stove, enough food and water for several days, Then I drove out to the grove where Jimmy's vehicle had been found. The police had finished processing the scene days ago, removed their tape and taken Jimmy's ute to the impound yard for forensic examination. There was nothing left to mark the spot, except some tire tracks in the red dirt and the overwhelming scent of poinciana flowers. The blooms were at their peak now, so dense they blocked out patches of sky. The sweet smell was almost narcotic in its intensity, making my head swim as I unloaded my gear. I pitched my tent about 50 meters from the grove, close enough to watch but far enough away to make a quick exit if needed. Not that I believed Mary's stories about spirits and supernatural nonsense, but the territory could be dangerous at night, in perfectly ordinary ways. Wild pigs that could disembowel a man with their tusks, snakes whose venom could kill in minutes, the occasional saltwater crocodile that wandered too far from water, following creek lines that had dried up decades ago. Plenty of real threats to worry about without adding ghosts to the list. The first night passed without incident. I sat by my campfire, drank a few beers from the cooler, and watched the grove for any sign of movement. Nothing but the usual bush sounds, crickets chirping in the undergrowth, the occasional rustle of small animals moving through the fallen leaves, the distant call of a nightjar hunting insects. Normal territory night sounds, familiar and reassuring. The fire crackled and spat, throwing dancing shadows across the red dirt. By midnight, I was starting to feel foolish, like a city tourist, chasing ghost stories. The second night was different. It started with the scent. Around midnight, the smell of poinciana flowers intensified dramatically, becoming almost overpowering. It was like someone had crushed a dozen blooms right under my nose, releasing their essence all at once. The sweetness was cloying, almost nauseating in its intensity. I walked closer to the grove, thinking maybe the night breeze was carrying the scent differently. But the smell seemed to follow me, rather than emanate from any particular source, growing stronger with each step I took toward the trees. By the time I reached the edge of the grove, it was so intense I could taste it on my tongue. Sweet and heavy, and somehow urgent, like flowers left too long in a closed room. Then I heard the whispers. At first, I thought it was just wind moving through the leaves, the normal sound of air flowing through branches and foliage. But as I listened more carefully, I could swear I heard actual words, soft and indistinct, but definitely human. A woman's voice, speaking too quietly to understand but with an urgency that made my skin crawl. The words seemed to come from everywhere, and nowhere at once, drifting through the grove like smoke. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam across the trees, the LED cutting bright circles through the darkness. But the light revealed nothing except red flowers and dark bark, shadows that danced and shifted with each movement of the beam. The whispers continued, seeming to respond to the light by growing softer but more insistent. "Jimmy?" I called out, feeling foolish but needing to try. My voice echoed strangely in the grove, as if the trees were absorbing the sound. "Jimmy, you out there, mate?" The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence so complete it made my ears ring. Even the crickets had gone quiet, their constant background chorus cut off like someone had thrown a switch. I stood there for what felt like hours, flashlight beam trembling in my hand as I swept it back and forth across the grove. But nothing else happened. Eventually, the normal night sounds resumed, slowly, cautiously, as if the bush itself had been holding its breath. I retreated to my tent with considerably less skepticism about Mary's warnings. The third night, I saw her. Not clearly, not at first. Just a pale shape moving between the trees, there one moment, and gone the next, when I tried to focus on it directly. I thought it might be a feral goat or a wallaby, but the movement was wrong, too upright, too deliberate, too purposeful in the way it drifted from shadow to shadow. I watched through my binoculars, the lenses bringing the grove into sharp focus. The shape moved with fluid grace between the tree trunks, always staying just at the edge of visibility. When I tried to follow it with the binoculars, it would vanish, only to reappear somewhere else entirely. The scent of flowers was stronger than ever, so intense it made me dizzy. My head swam with the sweetness and I had to sit down to keep from falling over. The whispers returned too, but this time I could make out fragments of words. "Come," I heard, soft and pleading. Lonely, drifted through the air like a sigh. And what sounded like please, repeated over and over in a voice that carried decades of pain. My rational mind told me to pack up and leave, to stop this foolishness, before it got me into real trouble. But Jimmy was out there somewhere, and if there was even a chance, no matter how small or impossible, that he was connected to whatever was happening in that grove. I had to see it through. I owed him that much, after the way I'd treated him. On the fourth night, she showed herself completely. I was sitting by my fire, around 11 o'clock, feeding dried wood to the flames and trying to stay alert. The night was warm and still, typical for the territory during the dry season. Then the temperature dropped suddenly, like someone had opened a freezer door. My breath began to mist, which shouldn't have been possible in the territory heat. The fire flickered and dimmed, despite the lack of wind, the flames guttering as if starved of oxygen. Condensation formed on my beer bottle, beads of water running down the glass like tears. Then she walked out from behind the largest poinciana tree. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with long black hair that hung straight to her waist. Her skin was pale, so pale it seemed to glow in the moonlight like phosphorescence. She wore a white dress that might have been stylish once, maybe in the 80s, given the cut and style, but now hung in tatters. The fabric was stained with dirt and what looked like old blood, rust brown, patches that had soaked deep into the material. In her hand she carried a small suitcase, the kind people used to travel with decades ago. Genuine leather with brass corners, scuffed and worn from years of use. But it was her face that made my blood freeze in my veins. Beautiful once maybe, with delicate features that spoke of mixed heritage. But now twisted with an anguish so deep it was painful to look at directly. Her eyes were dark holes in her skull at first glance, but as I stared, I could see they were filled with a sadness so profound it made my chest ache. When she opened her mouth, I could see that her teeth were stained black, as if she'd been drinking ink. She stood beneath the flowering tree, staring directly at me across the 50 meters that separated us. I felt a pull unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Not physical. Something deeper than that. Something that grabbed hold of my guilt and shame and yanked me toward her like a fish on a line. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run, to get back in my ute and drive as fast as I could toward Darwin. To put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever was standing under those trees. Instead, I found myself standing up, my legs moving without conscious direction. Walking toward her, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't resist. She spoke without moving her lips, her voice drifting through my mind like smoke through a broken window. "You understand," she said, and somehow I did understand, even though every rational part of me was screaming to run. "You know what it's like to be left behind." I stopped walking when I was about 10 feet from her, close enough to see the details that made her presence undeniably real. The fabric of her dress was cotton, once white, but now yellowed with age, and stained with mud and worse things. I could see individual threads in the weave, could smell the mustiness that came from fabric that had been buried underground. Her suitcase was genuine leather, scuffed and worn, with brass corners that had gone green with corrosion. The handle was wrapped in what looked like silk scarves, now faded and torn. Most unsettling of all were her eyes, not empty holes as they'd appeared from a distance, but filled with a sadness so profound it made my chest ache just to look at them. "My name was Sarah," she said, though her mouth still didn't move. The words formed directly in my head, each one carrying weight like stones dropped into still water. "Sarah Chen. I was 24 when he brought me here." Images flooded my mind, not my memories but hers. A young woman sitting in the passenger seat of a blue Ford sedan, laughing at something her boyfriend had said. The man was older, maybe in his 30s, with kind eyes and gentle hands. The same woman standing beside these very trees, her face bright with excitement, as he talked about their future together. About the life they were going to build, the children they would have, the house they would buy once he sorted out his divorce. Then confusion, hurt, as he told her he'd changed his mind. That his wife had found out about the affair, that she was threatening to take everything if he left. That he wasn't ready for marriage, for the life they'd planned. That he was sorry, but it was over. "He left me here," Sarah's voice continued, growing stronger, more insistent. "Drove away while I begged him not to go. Said I could walk back to town, that it would give me time to think." More images, Sarah standing by the roadside, as the blue Ford disappeared into the distance. Her face crumpling as she realized he wasn't coming back, that all his promises had been lies. But I didn't walk back to town. I couldn't face the shame, couldn't face telling everyone that I'd been abandoned. Sarah sitting on her suitcase as the sun set, then standing in the moonlight, then kneeling in the dirt as days passed and he didn't return. Her face growing thinner, her eyes more desperate. So I stayed here, under these beautiful trees, and I waited for him to come back. Finally, the rope she'd fashioned from her torn slip, and the sturdy branch of the poinciana tree that would hold her weight. That was 36 years ago, she said, her voice heavy with the weight of decades. 36 years of waiting, of watching the road for headlights that never came. Her eyes fixed on mine, and I saw the accumulated loneliness of all those years. The slow madness that comes from hope deferred too long. Do you know what that kind of loneliness does to a person? How it eats at you until there's nothing left but hunger. I tried to speak, to tell her I was sorry for what had happened to her, but my voice wouldn't work, the words dying in my throat before they could form. The compulsion to move closer was getting stronger, and I found my feet carrying me forward despite my resistance. You carry guilt, she observed, and now I could see her lips moving, though her voice still came from inside my head. Heavy guilt, the kind that keeps you awake at night. You said things you can't take back. Her pale face tilted slightly, studying me with eyes that saw too much. You failed someone you loved. The truth of it hit me like a physical blow, doubling me over with the force of recognition. Jimmy's face the last time I'd seen him, hurt and angry after our fight. The words I'd thrown at him about his drinking, about how he was wasting his life. How I'd stormed off without giving him a chance to respond, too stubborn and self-righteous to see that he was drowning. He came to me willingly, Sarah said, and her smile was terrible to see, beautiful and predatory at the same time, like a flower that ate insects. 3 nights ago he walked into my grove carrying so much pain. Her voice took on a satisfied tone, like someone describing a particularly good meal. Guilt about his drinking, shame about the things he'd done, fear that he was going to lose everything that mattered to him. She took a step closer, and the temperature dropped another degree. He was so ready to give up, so tired of fighting. Where is he? I managed to croak out, my voice barely a whisper. Instead of answering directly, she raised her hand, fingers pale as bone in the moonlight. The world around us shifted, reality bending like heat haze rising from summer asphalt. The grove remained, but it was different now, larger, darker, filled with shadows that moved independently of the moonlight. In those shadows, I could see shapes. Men, standing motionless among the trees, their faces blank and peaceful. I recognized Jimmy immediately, even though he looked different. Younger somehow, the lines of worry and stress erased from his features, the constant tension he'd carried in his shoulders was gone, replaced by an unnatural stillness. He stood beside a poinciana tree about 20 yards away, staring straight ahead with empty eyes. His mouth was slightly open, as if he'd been about to say something when time stopped. He's happy here, Sarah said, her voice soft with false kindness. They all are. No more guilt, no more shame, no more pain, just peace, forever and always. I counted the figures in the shadows, my eyes adjusting to the supernatural twilight. 5 men, including Jimmy, all standing like statues among the trees. Each one had the same peaceful expression, the same empty stare. The others, I said, my voice hoarse with horror. The other disappearances. Each one came to me in his darkest hour, she confirmed, moving closer with fluid grace. Peter Morrison, whose wife left him after he lost their house gambling. David Kruger, who killed a family in a car accident because he was driving drunk. She gestured to the motionless figures with proprietorial pride. Marcus Webb, who couldn't live with what he'd done in Afghanistan. Thomas Riley, who lost his children in a custody battle because of his violence. Her dark eyes fixed on mine, and I saw hunger there. Ancient, patient hunger that had been feeding for decades. And now Jimmy, who was drowning in bottles and self-hatred. The pull was getting stronger now, so strong I had to dig my heels into the dirt to keep from walking toward her. Part of me wanted to go, wanted to join Jimmy and the others in their peaceful oblivion. The guilt I carried felt impossibly heavy, not just about Jimmy, but about all the times I'd failed people I cared about. All the harsh words and missed opportunities and moments when I'd chosen pride over compassion. You don't have to carry it anymore, Sarah whispered, and her voice was almost kind now, seductive in its promise of relief. All that weight, all that regret, I can take it from you, just like I took it from them. She gestured to the trapped men, their faces serene in their captivity. No more guilt, no more shame, just peace, David, eternal peace. But as she spoke, I noticed something that cut through the supernatural compulsion like a blade. When she talked about the men she'd trapped, there was satisfaction in her voice. Even hunger. This wasn't mercy she was offering. It was predation. She fed on guilt and abandonment because they were familiar to her, because sharing her pain was the only way she could find relief from it. The men weren't at peace. They were fuel, keeping her anchored to the world through their suffering. No, I said, and took a step backward. The effort was enormous, like trying to walk through wet concrete, but I managed it, breaking the invisible chains that had been pulling me toward her. This isn't peace. This is prison. Her expression shifted, the false kindness falling away to reveal something ancient and hungry, something that had been feeding on pain for 36 years. You cannot resist, she hissed, and now her voice came from all around me. From the trees themselves, from the air, from the ground beneath my feet. I have been calling to broken men for decades. They all come to me in the end. Maybe, I admitted, taking another step back. My feet felt like they weighed 100 kilos each, but I forced them to move. But, not tonight. I thought about Jimmy, not the broken, guilt-ridden version of him that Sarah had trapped, but the real Jimmy, the mate who'd pulled me out of a burning cab when I'd crashed my truck 5 years ago, risking his own life to drag me clear of the wreckage, who'd sat with me in the hospital while they stitched up my face, bringing me magazines and terrible coffee and making jokes to keep my spirits up. The Jimmy who made terrible puns and sang off-key country songs and always bought the first round when we met up at the Roadhouse. The Jimmy who was struggling with his demons but was still worth fighting for, still worth saving. That love, that genuine affection for my mate, seemed to create a barrier around me. Sarah's influence was still there, still pulling at me, but I could push against it now. Could think clearly enough to see past her manipulations. Let them go, I said, taking another step back. The words came out stronger than I'd expected, carrying conviction I didn't know I possessed. Let Jimmy and the others go. Impossible. She snarled, her beautiful face twisting with rage. The temperature plummeted further and frost began forming on the ground around her feet. They are mine now. They chose to stay, chose to give up their pain. Her dark eyes blazed with supernatural fire. The only way they can be freed is if someone takes their place willingly. Someone carries all their guilt, all their shame, becomes the anchor that holds them here, while they return to the world. She was offering me a trade, my life for theirs, my eternal imprisonment for their freedom. Part of me wanted to take it, wanted to make that grand gesture that would save Jimmy, and prove I was a better mate than my guilt told me I was. But as I looked at her, really looked at her, I saw something else. Under all the supernatural power, all the hunger and manipulation, Sarah Chen was still just a 24-year-old woman who'd been abandoned by someone she loved. Her power came from her pain, but the pain came from a very human source. She'd been trapped here not by some cosmic force, but by her own inability to let go of what had been done to her. What was his name? I asked suddenly. The question seemed to catch her off guard, breaking the rhythm of her supernatural assault. What? Your boyfriend, the one who left you here. What was his name? Michael, she said, and for just a moment, her voice was purely human again, soft and sad and achingly young. Michael Zhang. We were going to get married in the spring. Tell me about him. Tell me about the good times. No, she shook her head violently, her hair whipping around her face like black silk. He left me. He abandoned me. He hurt you, I interrupted, my voice gentle but firm. I get that, but that's not all he was, is it? If it was, you wouldn't have loved him in the first place. For a moment, the grove flickered, and I caught a glimpse of what it really looked like. Just trees and dirt and shadows, nothing supernatural about it at all. The trapped men wavered like mirages, becoming more solid as Sarah's concentration broke. He used to sing to me, she whispered, and now tears were running down her cheeks. Real tears, not some ghostly manifestation. Chinese lullabies his grandmother taught him, and he made me laugh, even when I was sad. Her voice grew softer, more human with each word. He was going to teach me Cantonese so I could talk to his parents properly, so they would accept me as part of the family. That's the Michael worth remembering, I said gently. Not the scared kid who panicked and made the worst mistake of his life. The one who loved you enough that you were willing to build a future with him. But he left me, she said again, though with less venom now. More hurt than anger. Yeah, he did. And that was wrong, and cruel, and it hurt you in ways that never healed. I took a careful step closer, testing whether the compulsion was still there. It was, but weaker now, more manageable. But Sarah, I used her name deliberately, the name she'd told me, the name that connected her to the living world. Sarah, you had a life before that moment. You had dreams and hopes, and people who cared about you. The grove shimmered again, reality asserting itself as her grip on the supernatural weakened. I could see Jimmy blinking, confusion replacing the blank peace on his face. The other men were stirring too, looking around as if waking from a deep sleep. You were more than just the woman who got abandoned under the poinciana trees. I can't let go, Sarah said, and now she just sounded lost and frightened. Like a child afraid of the dark. If I let go, if I stop holding on to the pain, then what's left? Who am I if I'm not the woman he abandoned? You're Sarah Chen, I said firmly, putting all the conviction I could muster into my voice. You're the woman Michael Zhang fell in love with, the woman who was strong enough to plan a future and brave enough to love someone completely. She was crying openly now, and with each tear she looked more solid, more human. The supernatural presence that had surrounded her was fading, replaced by simple grief. You're the woman who deserved better than what happened to her but who was so much more than her worst day. I've been so angry for so long, she said, her voice breaking. So lonely. I thought, if I could make others understand, if I could share the pain, it would hurt less. It doesn't work that way, I told her, my own voice gentle with understanding. Pain shared like that just makes more pain. But there's another way to share it, by letting people help you carry it until you're strong enough to let it go. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw recognition in her eyes. The recognition of someone who understood what it meant to carry guilt and regret. You came here for your friend, yeah. Even knowing it might trap you too. Yeah. That's love, she said wonderingly, as if she'd forgotten such a thing existed. Real love, the kind that doesn't abandon people when things get hard. She turned to look at Jimmy, who was now fully conscious, and staring around the grove in bewilderment. The other men were moving too, walking slowly toward the edge of the trees as if waking from a dream. I remember now, Sarah said, and her voice was growing fainter. More distant, as if she was speaking from a great height. I remember what it felt like to love someone that much. Michael might have failed me in the end, but for a while he loved me like that. The grove was normal now, just trees and moonlight and the sweet scent of flowers. Sarah was fading, becoming translucent, but she looked peaceful for the first time since I'd seen her. For a while, I was someone worth loving. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible now. Thank you for helping me remember who I was before the pain. She smiled then, a genuine smile that transformed her face completely. I could see the young woman she'd been before tragedy changed her, full of hope and dreams and the capacity for joy. Then she was gone, and I was alone in the grove with 5 confused men and the sound of wind in the poinciana trees. Jimmy and the others were found alive but confused the next morning, wandering along the highway about 2 kilometers from the grove. A road train driver spotted them just after dawn, 5 men in various states of disorientation stumbling along the asphalt like survivors of a plane crash. The police picked them up within minutes, 5 men who claimed they couldn't remember where they'd been or how they'd gotten there. The official report would list it as a case of shared disorientation, possibly caused by some kind of environmental factor or contaminated water source. The investigators never did figure out what had happened to them during their missing days, weeks and months. I was there when the ambulance brought Jimmy in for observation at Catherine District Hospital. The building was small and understaffed, typical for territory healthcare, but the nurses were competent and kind. Jimmy looked older somehow, like he'd aged years in the few days he'd been gone. But physically he was fine. Better than fine, actually. The constant tremor in his hands from too much drinking was gone completely. His eyes were clearer than I'd seen them in months, free of the bloodshot look that had become his normal appearance. Even his skin looked healthier, less sallow and drawn. "Mate," he said when he saw me in the hospital corridor, his voice stronger than it had been in ages. "What the hell happened?" Last thing I remember was driving out toward Catherine, and then nothing. Like someone switched off the lights. I sat down beside his bed and studied his face carefully. There was no recognition there. No memory of Sarah or the grove or being trapped between worlds. No recollection of standing motionless among the trees for days. Maybe that was for the best. Some experiences weren't meant to be carried around in your head forever, weren't meant to be remembered in the harsh light of day. "You had an accident," I told him, which wasn't entirely a lie. "Hit your head. You've been missing for 4 days. 4 days? He rubbed his forehead, looking genuinely bewildered. "Christ. No wonder I feel like I've been sleeping for a week." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I could see genuine concern in his eyes. "You look like hell, Dave. Have you been searching for me this whole time?" I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. The relief of having him back, alive and whole and himself again, was overwhelming. I'd been carrying the weight of possibly losing him for days, and now that the pressure was off, I felt hollow and exhausted. Like a balloon with all the air let out. That's more than I deserved," Jimmy said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "Especially after our last conversation. I was a right bastard to you, wasn't I? Calling you drunk, telling you to mind your own business when you were just trying to help." "You weren't that bad," I lied, though we both knew the truth. Nah, I was. "I've been thinking about it, or dreaming about it, maybe. Can't tell the difference right now." He picked at the hospital blanket, his movements more coordinated than they'd been in months. "But I remember being angry at you for caring about me when I'd stopped caring about myself. That's no way to treat a mate." The irony wasn't lost on me. Sarah had been trapped by the pain of abandonment, but she'd also trapped others who were struggling with their own guilt and isolation. Jimmy had come to her because he was drowning in self-loathing and alcohol, pushing away everyone who tried to help him. The other men had probably been carrying similar burdens: regret, loneliness, the kind of emotional pain that makes you want to disappear from your own life. "We all say things we don't mean when we're hurting," I told him, and meant every word. "The important thing is, you're back." Over the next few days, I learned more about the other men who'd been found. Derek Morrison had been missing for 6 months. His wife had reported him gone after he'd cleaned out their joint bank account and left a note saying he couldn't handle being a failure anymore. Now he was calling her from the hospital, confused but eager to come home. Mark Stevens had disappeared 8 months ago following a divorce that had left him suicidal. His ex-wife was driving down from Darwin to pick him up, tears in her voice when she'd spoken to the hospital staff. The others had similar stories, men who'd been swallowed up by their own despair and guilt, whose families had given them up for dead. Now they were all back, confused but alive, with no memory of where they'd been. The families were overjoyed, the police were baffled, and the media briefly picked up the story as a feel-good mystery before moving on to other news. Nobody connected it to the old stories about the Poinciana woman, and I wasn't about to enlighten them. Some stories were better left untold. Mary, the Aboriginal elder who'd first told me about Sarah, sought me out a week later. I was having coffee at the roadhouse trying to process everything that had happened, when she appeared at my table like she'd materialized from thin air. "The trees are quiet now," she said without preamble, settling into the opposite seat with fluid grace. Her dark eyes were bright with satisfaction. "Are they? No more whispers in the wind. No more cold spots under the branches. She's gone, isn't she? Really gone this time?" I nodded, remembering Sarah's final smile. "I think so." Mary studied my face with those knowing eyes that seemed to see everything. "You did something. You spoke to her." "Yeah. And you lived to tell about it. Not many could have done that, especially not a white fella who doesn't believe in spirits." There was approval in her voice and something like respect. "What did you tell her?" I thought about it for a moment, trying to find the right words. I reminded her who she was before the pain took over. Helped her remember that she was more than just her worst day. Mary smiled, the expression transforming her weathered face. "Ah, you gave her back her name." "Something like that. Names are powerful things. When we lose them, when we let ourselves become nothing but our pain or our mistakes, we stop being human." She leaned back in her chair, her hands folded peacefully in her lap. "We become something else: hunger, need, endless want. She'd forgotten she was ever anything but abandoned. I sipped my coffee and watched the road through the window. A convoy of road trains was rolling past, their chrome catching the afternoon sun like mirrors. Normal life, normal problems, normal freight to be moved from point A to point B. The other men, I said, watching the trucks disappear into the distance, they don't remember anything. Memory's funny like that. Sometimes forgetting is a mercy. Mary's voice was soft, but certain. They went to her willingly because they couldn't live with themselves. But now they're back, and whatever was eating at them has been processed, transformed. She paused, choosing her words carefully. They'll be different men now, even if they don't know why. I thought about Jimmy, how the constant shake in his hands had disappeared, how his eyes looked clearer. How he'd called me mate, instead of launching into another drunken tirade about his failures. Maybe Mary was right. Maybe some kinds of healing happened in places the conscious mind couldn't reach. What about you? Mary asked, her dark eyes fixed on mine. What did you learn out there in the grove? That was a harder question to answer. I'd gone into those trees carrying guilt about Jimmy's disappearance, blaming myself for the argument that had sent him driving off into the night. I'd been prepared to trade my life for his if necessary, which probably made me exactly the kind of man Sarah's spirit would have been drawn to. But I'd also learned something else. The guilt I was carrying, it was real, and it had weight, but it didn't have to define me. I'd made mistakes with Jimmy, said things I shouldn't have, but I'd also cared enough to search for him when he was lost, had been willing to risk my own life to bring him back. That mattered too, maybe more than the harsh words. I learned that grief and guilt can trap us worse than any spirit, I said finally. That we can disappear from our own lives without ever leaving town. Mary nodded approvingly, her smile widening. Now that's wisdom worth having. Don't waste it. She left as quietly as she'd arrived, and I sat there finishing my coffee and thinking about the long road ahead. Not just the highway back to Darwin, but the ongoing work of being alive in the world, of maintaining connections with people, even when it was difficult, of caring about others without drowning in responsibility for their choices. Jimmy was getting help, real help this time, not just well-meaning lectures from friends. He'd checked himself into a program up in Darwin and seemed genuinely committed to getting sober. The memory loss had given him a kind of reset, a chance to start over without the full weight of his accumulated shame. I wasn't sure if that was fair or not, but I wasn't going to question mercy when I saw it. The other men were having similar experiences. Derek had reconciled with his wife and was seeing a counselor about his depression. Mark was attending support groups and had started talking to his kids again. They all seemed bewildered by their own recovery, as if they'd expected to stay broken forever and were surprised to find they could heal. Maybe that was Sarah's final gift, not just releasing them from her realm, but somehow taking away some of the poison they'd been carrying. I didn't understand the mechanics of it, and I probably never would. Some things existed beyond the reach of logic and explanation, in the spaces between what we knew and what we felt. I paid for my coffee and walked out to where my truck was parked. The sun was getting low, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange that made the territory look like paradise. Soon it would be dark, and the poinciana trees along the highway would release their sweet scent into the night air. But now they were just trees again, beautiful, natural, part of the landscape instead of a trap for the desperate and the lost. I climbed into the cab and started the engine, feeling the familiar rumble of diesel power beneath me. This was who I was, a truckie, a man who moved things from one place to another, who spent his life on the road between destinations. It was honest work, necessary work, and it suited me. But I was also a friend, someone who would drive into dark places to find people he cared about. That mattered too, maybe more than anything else. We're all haunted by something: regret, loss, the weight of our own imperfections. The trick is not letting those ghosts become the only thing we are. I pulled out onto the highway and pointed the truck toward Darwin, 18 wheels rolling smooth on familiar asphalt. Behind me, the poinciana groves were settling into evening quiet. No whispers in the wind now, no cold spots or supernatural presences. Just the normal sounds of the Australian bush, birds calling their evening songs, wind in the leaves, the distant hum of traffic on the Stewart Highway. The radio crackled to life as I picked up a transmission from another truckie heading south. Breaker 19, this is Midnight Express northbound at the 47 kilometers mark. Anyone got their ears on? I reached for the handset, the familiar weight of it comfortable in my palm. This is Desert Rose southbound, got you loud and clear, Midnight Express. Quote,